Hi, everyone, and welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. I hope you had a wonderful week, and I want to thank you for choosing to join me on this lovely Friday afternoon. And today we are going to be discussing different types of pagan paths. We'll also be kind of talking a bit about what it's like to combine different pagan paths and how that works. So, if that sounds like a topic that you are interested in, then you are in the right place. If you are new here, I do Pagan Happy Hour every Friday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. And it's just a really great way for me to connect with you all, for us pagans all over the world to share our thoughts and ideas. And it's meant to be a interactive conversation. So I will be looking over here as we go along to the chat, where I will be bringing in your thoughts and your ideas into the conversation as well. So there are two ways you can support the show if you are interested. The first is through my Patreon, which I have linked down below. If you do choose to become my patron, you also gain access to my exclusive Discord community, which is a great place where you can find fellow pagans and chat and learn from each other. And the other great way you can support the show is through the super chat button, which is the $ button at the bottom of the chat box area. And through that, you can donate any amount, and your question or comment will pop up really big for me. So I'll be sure to bring your thoughts and your ideas into the conversation. So now that we got that out of the way, why don't you in the comments tell me where you are watching from today and what you happen to be drinking? Let me cue that drink music. Okay, so today I'm just having a nice light white wine, but let me see what you guys are up to today. Okay, looks like we have people chiming in from Louisiana, DC, Arkansas, Michigan, Sweden, North Dakota, Germany, England, Pennsylvania, let's see, North Carolina, Houston, Brooklyn, Exeter, the UK. Let's see, Illinois, Ontario, Denmark, Ohio, Kentucky, upstate New York, Arlington, Texas, Australia, Quebec, Maine, Dallas, California, Maryland, and Birmingham. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for choosing to join me today. Yeah, and let's jump into it. This has been a topic that was heavily requested. It's been a topic I've kind of gone over in a few different ways throughout the years on my channel. So, of course, I will have follow-up videos you can always check up on if you go to my search bar in my channel and you type in different types of pagans, different types of witches. I have lots of content like that. So if you like this Pagan Happy Hour, definitely check that out afterward. So now I kind of feel like we kind of need to start by attempting to define what a pagan is, right? Because if we're going to be talking about different types of paganism, we need to kind of figure out what it means to be pagan, right? So let me turn off this wine music, have a sip of my drink, and we will get started. Okay, so I'd love for you all in the comments to share your own personal definition of paganism or what it means to be pagan. Obviously, there are differing opinions on this. This is just going to be my own personal opinion. But for me, I think paganism is a religion that is based on pre-Christian cultures and that usually has an aspect of nature that is integral to the religious and the spiritual practice. You have those two kind of components, pre-Christian civilization and nature holding a big importance in the faith. So that's a pretty wide umbrella definition that can include a lot of different faiths within it. But I'd love to hear in the comments how you might define what paganism is, because I'm just one person. And throughout this conversation, I do want you to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Let's see. I see in the comments here, Alana is saying that paganism is a nature-based religion that is pre-Christian. Definitely agree. Pretty similar to my version of the definition. Let's see. Krishna says a polytheistic nature-based practice. Yeah, definitely agree. Let's see. What else do we have? Mighty Sarlacc says that paganism is worshiping nature. That's an interesting one. Let's see. What else do we have? Let's see. Annika says, my definition is the same as yours. It's a combination of nature-based religion that draws on pre-Christian traditions. And Emily says, the nature aspect is the biggest for me, and that I always find my spirituality in nature. Awesome. So it sounds like a lot of you all have a similar personal definition of what paganism means. So I think I'm on the right track here, which is good to see. So I've been thinking a lot about this on how do we kind of define these different pagan paths. And in my personal opinion, you can kind of group them into two different groups. So I kind of think that with paganism, you have group one. These are the pagan religions that mostly disappeared after Christianization took place. And then the other group is the group of pagan religions where Christianization or monotheistic expansion was unsuccessful for the most part, and it's more of a continuous line. So you have these two main groups. Now, you're probably pretty familiar with aspects or paths or religions in both of these groups. And looking at group one, the religions that were pagan and mostly disappeared after Christianization, this is where you get pagan paths such as Norse paganism or Celtic paganism, where Christianization pretty much wiped out a vast majority of pagan practices. While, of course, some things do survive, it's not that much. In this category, you also have things like Hellenism or Greek paganism, or even Roman paganism. While, yes, we do have more written material about those pagan religions and their practices that survives, it was still mostly wiped out by Christianity. If you're interested in kind of learning more about that transitional stage, I recommend the book, The Darkening Age. I believe that's by the author, is it Catherine Nixie? Or watching the movie Agora, which is starring Rachel Weisz, one of my favorites. So that's kind of all about this weird transitional time in the Greco-Roman world where paganism kind of fell and Christianity rose. Oh, we have our first super chat from FT Family Channel. Thank you so much. That says, it's amazing that there are so many different ways, so many different roads. Our world is wonderful. Yes, and that is one of the great things about paganism. As we are discussing these different paths and how to define and categorize them, it's sometimes, you forget how amazing it is that there are so many variations here. And we have so much freedom and flexibility, which you don't always find in other religious traditions. So thank you so much for that super chat. But yeah, so within this group of pagan religions that mostly disappeared, we mentioned Celtic, we mentioned Norse, Hellenic, Roman. In this group, you might also have Slavic paganism. You might also have Kemeticism, which is a worship of the ancient Egyptian deities, even like Mesoamerican paganism. So this would be the Aztec or the Mayan religions. So all of these religions, for the most part, were wiped out. Of course, in some of these areas, you kind of have this interesting fusion between Christianity and the pagan religions. And of course, you definitely see that in Celtic paganism, as well in Norse paganism, especially in something like Imbolc, which was a recent Celtic pagan holiday that I covered on my channel that honors Bridget. And Bridget was a Celtic pagan goddess. She was a goddess of fire, of smithing, of child carrying and childbirth, among so many other things. And of course, a goddess of healing and healing wells. She eventually became a saint. So Christianity took this pagan goddess and just put saint in front of her name, right? And many of the sites that were sacred to her, the holy wells, became kind of Christian holy wells. So it's not that everything was lost in the Christianization process, but the vast majority was. And us as modern pagans, if we choose to follow one of these paths, we're going to be doing a lot of guesswork. I recommend checking out a video I did a couple years ago on Pagan Reconstructionism. And in that video, I talked about how, as someone who follows one of these paths, I personally follow kind of a combination of Celtic and Norse paganism. I'm constantly having to reconstruct some of these ancient practices from the little that we know. And of course, I'm not going to get it right, right? We just don't know enough. And a lot of those practices I wouldn't want to necessarily perform entirely authentically, even if I could, right? Because, there was a lot of animal sacrifice and stuff like that back in the day, which is something I'm obviously not going to be doing in the modern 21st century. So in pagan reconstructionism, what we're doing is we're taking these little gems, these little bits and pieces that we do have from written sources, from the archaeological record, from material culture, from folklore, and we are trying to understand how we can incorporate some of those practices in the modern day while staying true to their original intent. So that's a tricky task. It definitely is. And it makes this path both difficult and rewarding. So that's kind of that first group where we have reconstructions of these pagan religions that were mostly wiped out. And us modern pagans are trying to figure out how do we restore them in some way. And when you think about it, almost all, if not all, cultures around the world were pagan at one time. So pick a place on the map. You can probably figure out a little bit about what paganism was like for that culture before monotheism took hold. And then you can study, how can I take these lessons, these ideas, these deities, and bring them into a modern practice that I can do here and now in the modern age. So that's that first group. And then next we'll tackle the group where, representing pagan faiths and religions where the conversion to Christianity was unsuccessful. So they kind of have a longer unbroken chain. But before we do, let me check your comments here and see what you guys have to say about that. Okay, we have a super chat from Herkunger. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let me see what else you guys have to say here. Jonathan has an interesting comment that says, we should be more acknowledged. We have survived thousands of years of judgment, hate, and condemnation. Yes, I have an interesting story to tell about this, if you don't mind me going on a bit of a tangent. This story is from when I was visiting Rome for the first time. And I was on a tour of the Colosseum, so I had a tour guide, and he was discussing kind of this Christianization period in Rome. And he actually used the words, the pagan Holocaust. I'm like, what? I've never heard anyone say that. And then he said, yes, millions of pagans were killed in this process. And I think he probably freaked out a lot of the other members of my tour group. But then I was like, oh my God, this is interesting. I can't believe you're using such impactful terminology that maybe I personally wouldn't use. But there is something there where paganism was kind of forcefully lost. It was destroyed when monotheism took hold. For the most part of the entire world, the pagan faith was mostly lost. And, and I was just like, whoa, this guy's intense, but also I want to learn more. Um, let's see, what else do you guys have to say? Let's see. Charlie says it's very rare to find texts on any of the older pagan religions. We're very lucky to have the Sumerians and the Egyptians that did write a lot down. Good point. So, Sumerian or Middle Eastern pagan religions, we do know a decent amount about them, as well as Egyptian. We actually know quite a bit about how the Egyptians practiced their religion, to the extent that you can even kind of replicate certain ancient Egyptian spells. I recommend getting a copy of the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the pyramid texts. That would be a good place to start. But bringing up a great point there. Let's see, what else do we have? Uh, let's see, question from Kaylee that's asking, what are some of your favorite sources for finding information? I recommend checking out a video I did a few weeks ago on my pagan bookshelf tour, where I take you through all my different books. And I also have links for a bunch of books on that. So that would be a good one to check out. Okay, let's see. Oh, and then I see a comment here from Mighty Sarlacc that says, I wish we knew more about the Druids. Yes, the Druids were one of those groups that we know barely anything about. I do have several videos I've done on the Druids in the past where I kind of explore the Druids in more depth, but they share their information through the oral tradition. So they did know vast amounts of things about medicine, politics, astrology. The Druids had a lot of roles in the society, but all of that information was learned in an academy and was memorized. So nothing was really written down, unless you count like the Om script, which doesn't really give us that much information. So, oh, and I do apologize if my lights are going a little bit wonky today. It is kind of someone mentioning in the comments there might be ghosts here. So, sorry about that. There may as well be ghosts in this room. This house is from 1905, so it's possible. So, we talked about this first group of pagan paths. Let's now talk a bit about this second group. So, this second group of pagan paths, these are faiths that did not get destroyed by monotheism, that still kind of persist to modern day times. Now, the most obvious one that I'm sure you're all familiar with is Hinduism. Now, Hinduism might not be called pagan, and many Hindus would not necessarily call themselves pagan. But if we use the definition that we started this pagan happy hour with, then Hinduism would kind of fit that mold. So you have Hinduism in India, and you have Shintoism in Japan. And a lot of these kind of pagan paths that are extremely ancient and were not as affected by Christianization, they often have a strong animist bent to them. And I recommend checking out my Pagan Happy Hour episode all about animism if you're interested in learning about that. But Shintoism, especially, is heavily influenced by animism. So you have Hinduism, you have Shintoism, you have the religion of Native American tribes here in America. You have voodoo in the Afro-Caribbean sense. You have, let's see, what else do we have? Any type of indigenous culture probably has some form of paganism that is still being practiced today. Now, a lot of them were, somewhat impacted by Christianity. I mean, people were forced to ignore their indigenous religion and faith and were forced to become Christian. But those that did hold on to this knowledge, that knowledge has kind of persevered a bit better than many of the other pagan paths that we mentioned in the previous group. Now, there are some things about this group of religions that I find interesting. The first is sometimes they can be a good source for us that are interested in pagan paths where we are lacking information. So, for example, say you are interested in Celtic paganism. We barely know anything about Celtic paganism. But Hinduism actually comes from the same group of people, the Indo Europeans, that Celtic paganism comes from. You can just imagine people migrating, right? North and south. So you can look at a religion like modern day Hinduism, and of course, Hinduism has changed and evolved over millennia. But you can kind of look at those practices, and those practices have maybe the same root universal concepts and ideas and structures that they might have had in Celtic pagan traditions. So we can kind of look at some of these pagan paths as inspiration on how we might reconstruct European pagan paths. Obviously, there's going to be, some change and evolution and disconnect there, but it can be an interesting resource to look at. So you have Hinduism, Shintoism, religion of indigenous cultures, and things like that. That I think shouldn't be ignored. They should be studied, and we can learn a lot from them. However, I would note that many of these paths are kind of considered closed to the general public in the sense that not just anyone can become a voodoo priestess, for example. Not everyone can become a Native American shaman. Often you need to be a member of that specific culture or heritage in order to fully practice that faith. Which is one of the reasons that I don't focus too much of my channel on those areas, and I mostly stick towards European paganism. Um, since that's an area that's pretty open, anyone can really join, and it also happens to connect with my own personal heritage and ancestry. So I did want to mention that, but there's still a lot we can learn from those paths, even if we're not necessarily going to be becoming, a voodoo priestess or becoming Shinto or something like that. So let me see what you guys have to say about the second group of pagan paths. Let's see. Interesting comment that says some of those pagan paths don't always like being referred to as pagan, just because of the connotations attached to the word. Yes, I agree. I wouldn't call a Hindu person pagan like in person. Like I feel like that might be a little bit rude. Um, but I just want to bring that up as it shares a lot with many of the other pagan faiths. Let's see. Krishna is mentioning the Yoruba religion and the Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Cuban communities. Yes, that's another great one to bring up here. Let's see. Anything else you guys wanted to share? Erwin has an interesting comment that says, I'm convinced that the old European religions, except maybe the Greco-Roman ones, were much more animistic than we think. I might agree with you there. I've personally become more animistic as my own pagan practice has evolved. So I think you might be right. Let's see. Anything else you guys wanted to share on this topic? Awesome. Okay, so we talked about these kind of two separate paths, right? Now, I wanted to talk briefly about what it's like to combine several of these paths, and then we'll talk a bit about Wicca and witchcraft because that's kind of like, in a way, its own thing. So let's talk a minute about how do we combine pagan paths and should you combine pagan paths? Because this is a question. And let me know in the comments how you feel about this idea. Like, should someone just be a Celtic pagan and that's it? And you just work with those deities and those practices and those holidays and those festivals? Or do you think it's okay to kind of combine things? It's an interesting question. I want to hear your thoughts on this. And for me personally, I do a bit of combining. I am a bit eclectic in my pagan practice. I do work in the Celtic pantheon and the Norse pantheon. So I combine Celtic paganism and Norse paganism. And I also throw in a bit of Wicca from time to time because that's how I was first introduced into paganism, which I think many other people have that same experience where they kind of have their entry point to paganism through Wicca. And I've gained a lot through that practice. So I still celebrate the 8 Wiccan Sabbats, for example, which of course you can see in all of my Sabbat videos. I probably have like 50 of them at this point. So I combine several of these different paths. Now, for me personally, it is based on my heritage. I'm Danish and British, so that's kind of why I picked those. Though you don't have to be of the heritage of the pagan path that you follow. So there's a lot of, kind of open, accessible paths, I think, that are more than welcome for you to join, for anyone to join, which is one of the great things about paganism. I just chose those paths because I personally happen to resonate with them. And in those paths, they do often do some ancestor work. And so it is kind of just that extra layer of experience I get to have. But let me know your thoughts on this idea of should we be combining paths or not? Let me see what you guys have to say. Let's see. Priya says some of us are mixed. In her case, Celtic and Slavic with a little Viking. So it makes sense to combine these paths as it honors all of the ancestors, not one branch. Yeah, and I kind of wonder if this combining pagan paths is something that's actually more common in America because so many of us in America are mutts. We are a combination of different ethnicities and heritage. And so we kind of want to pull from those different experiences. So I'm kind of similar in that way. Let's see. Okay. Jenna says, I believe we have to grow in our pagan paths, not just relive the way things were done. I agree with that as well. We don't want to be static in our faith. Paganism evolved significantly for the pagans. If you look at something like the Roman Empire, what their religion was like in the early stages was very different than what it was like towards the end of the Roman Empire. So I think knowing that gives us a lot of flexibility to constantly be evolving and changing the past. So just because we look towards these past civilizations for inspiration, that doesn't mean we need to fully replicate exactly what they did. We can put our own spin on it. We can add our own sense of modernity, I guess you can say, to them. Let's see, what else do we have? Charlie says, I think it's perfectly fine to combine the pagan religions because the more we combine, the more we preserve. That's an interesting point because there are so few pagans, at least compared to the other main monotheistic religions, that the more we are researching about different paths, the more we are practicing different paths and sharing that knowledge with others, that means that that knowledge is going to be preserved. So I like that idea. I can see Lily Bell has chosen to join us. Let's see how she does here. Hopefully, she's not too disruptive. Let's see. Um, okay, lots of comments. They are flowing in. I love how you guys have so many thoughts on this topic. James Russell in the comments says, everyone's path is uniquely their own. There is no right or wrong. Yeah, so paganism is a bit different than other religions in the sense that we get to formulate our own paths. There is no like pope out there telling us what we can and cannot do. So it is my personal opinion that you can choose which path or paths you would like to incorporate, and that it is totally okay to follow your intuition, follow your heart in this regard. Um, Emily has a good question that says, I'm struggling with to combine pantheons or not, or where to start. My ancestry is mostly Celtic, but I haven't found a connection. I'm interested in Hellenism, but worried about it if it doesn't work out. Well, Emily, I think the best thing to do is just try Hellenism. See how it resonates with you. Maybe create an altar, leave a couple offerings, research the Greek gods and goddesses. And if that keeps resonating with you, then go for it. If not, maybe move to something else. So we have that flexibility with paganism, which is really awesome. We have a super chat from FT Family Channel that says, I'm a mixture of everything, but mostly work with the triple goddesses and gods. Yes, and the triple deities are super fascinating. I've spoken quite a bit about them, especially in my Pagan Happy Hour episode on Hecate. But yeah, great point. Okay. Um, okay, so we've talked a bit kind of about combining. Obviously, you now know my opinion that I think it is okay to combine. And in fact, I think it can be really rewarding to combine. And it also can increase our understanding of paganism as a whole, because I think all the pagan religions tapped into these universal truths, and that the more pagan faiths you study, the more you're able to understand and analyze and incorporate these real true insights. So that's my opinion. But next, let's talk a bit about Wicca, because I wanted to kind of create this separate section here for Wicca, because Wicca is a bit different than those other two categories that we mentioned. Those two categories being the pre-Christian faiths that were mostly kind of destroyed by Christianity, and the ones that were not fully Christianized and preserved to the modern day. Then we have Wicca. So Wicca is quite a fascinating subject. And it's how I got introduced into paganism. It's how many of you got introduced into paganism, and is probably the most popular form of paganism. If you're unsure of the differences between paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft, I do have a video kind of lining out those differences. But basically, Wicca is a branch or a form of paganism. But Wicca isn't necessarily based on a pre Christian civilization. I would say it is inspired by one. And specifically, it was inspired by Celtic paganism. Wicca is a religion that was created by a man named Gerald Garner. He created it in the 50s. He claimed to have been initiated into a coven, or this ancient, this long lineage of a coven. This is a bit disputed, so take a grain of salt with that. But what he did is he formulated a religion, an earth-based pagan religion that was inspired by Celtic paganism, but obviously not a direct connection to it. He wasn't necessarily looking at archaeological records, material culture, oral tradition, but he might have been inspired by some of those things. So now you're probably already familiar with Wicca through the Wheel of the Year. The Wheel of the Year is something that I discuss regularly on my channel. It's something many pagans celebrate, including myself, because I find it so spiritually fulfilling. It helps me connect with the natural world. It helps me stay attuned to the cycles in nature, because one of those universal truths that almost every pagan culture and civilization tapped into is that time is cyclical, not linear, which is kind of different than many monotheistic religions, right? You live, you die, you go to heaven. In paganism, it's a bit more complex. Usually there's some type of reincarnation involved, not always, but that tends to be the case. And also, you're looking at nature for inspiration. And of course, nature is cyclical. The plant grows from the seed, it flourishes, it blooms, it dies. That organic matter then like fertilizes the next seed to grow, right? You get it. It's cyclical, along with the cycles of the moon and everything like that. So I love the Wheel of the Year, and that's something that Wicca kind of created. Now, other pagan cultures, of course, had festivals and celebrations. In fact, we've discussed and celebrated many of them on this channel, the most recent being Lupercalia, which was just a few days ago, which was an ancient Roman celebration, which is kind of akin to our modern day Valentine's. But the Wheel of the Year is probably the most well known, and that is a combination of the four traditional Gaelic or Irish pagan festivals. And let's see, we just had Imbolc, and then we'll have Beltane, and then the next one would be Lunastad in the summer, and then Samhain in the fall. So those are the four traditional Irish, Gaelic, Celtic pagan holidays. Gerald Gardner combined those with the solstices and the equinoxes. He picked the solstices and the equinoxes as a lot of the ancient stone circles are aligned towards those points. So there's a lot of theory that those days were really important to the ancient Celts, and not just the ancient Celts. Many different pagan cultures honored the solstices and the equinoxes. So that's kind of an interesting point with Wicca here. We're kind of inspired by Celtic paganism, but he also kind of throws some other stuff in as well. And it's not so much about a specific pantheon, it's more so about a god and a goddess. And then within that, you can work with different pantheons if you choose. So you can be Wiccan and work with the Greek gods. You can be Wiccan and work with the Egyptian gods. You can be Wiccan and work with just a god and a goddess, or you can be Wiccan and just work with a goddess. There's a lot of flexibility there. And on top of that, there are different paths within Wicca. So Gerald Gardner has his own path of Wicca, this lineage called Gardnerian Wicca. So this is a form of Wicca that, again, is inspired by Celtic paganism, but also takes a lot of inspiration from secret societies and orders, such as the Order of the Golden Dawn. So a lot of the ritual magic components comes from these secret societies. Then you also have Alexandrian Wicca, which is a slightly different type of Wicca. You even have like the fairy tradition, and all of these can be kind of considered like lineages or subsets of Wicca. So within Wicca itself, you have all these different paths. If it wasn't confusing enough, right? So if you choose to become Wiccan, you can choose one of these paths, or just like with paganism, like we discussed earlier, you can become an eclectic Wiccan, where you can do your own thing. You can combine pantheons. You can choose to pick up, different pieces from different paths that inspire you and kind of meld them together in your own spiritual system. There's a lot of flexibility there. Now, if you choose a specific Wiccan path, say you want to be a Gardnerian witch or follow Gardnerian Wicca, you're not necessarily going to be eclectic. There's going to be specific, traditions and customs and rules that you follow, because that's what makes up that particular tradition. But if you don't want to work with one of those lineages, you can definitely be eclectic. You can be solitary, you can do your own thing, or you can create your own coven that has its own system. That's totally doable within the Wiccan faith. Let's see, what else do you guys have to say? Monica says, I like the Wheel of the Year as it's a nice way to add structure to my year. Definitely agree there. Let's see, what else do we have? Chanel Williams says, I prefer to be eclectic. Yep, I'm definitely pretty much eclectic as well. Happy Trees says, I believe the different pantheons are all linked by their archetypes. I agree with that as well. I'm kind of the opinion that the deities are kind of archetypal representations, and that's something I'm going to probably talk a bit more about in a video I have coming out next week. Let's see. What else do we have? Another point here is that within Wicca, there are kind of more guidelines. Now, you've probably heard of like the rule of three, or the concept of like white magic and black magic, or don't do curses or hexes or things like that. And now that doesn't necessarily have a precedent with Gerald Gardner. I don't think he kind of created the rule of three or the "and it harm none, do what you will." But modern day Wicca definitely does have a bent towards that. So it is a bit restrictive in that way. What kind of brings me to the next point that I wanted to discuss is, how does witchcraft fit into paganism and Wicca? So we're going to talk about that next. Before we do, we have another super chat from Storm Chase Mike. Thank you so much. That says, hi, Scarlett. I recently converted from Christianity and now am Germanic heathen. Awesome. Cheers. Thank you so much for the super chat. I'm glad you're enjoying the channel. So let's talk a bit about witchcraft and how this kind of fits in. And it doesn't always fit in. There are definitely ways to be pagan without doing any witchcraft. In fact, many pagans don't do any witchcraft at all, but it can be incorporated into certain pagan paths. And within witchcraft, you can kind of look at it as two types of witchcraft: Wiccan witchcraft and traditional witchcraft. And I've done a video on this too, kind of comparing Wicca versus traditional witchcraft. What are these two systems? How do they connect? Where are they different? Now, with Wiccan witchcraft, I already mentioned it's kind of based on this system of, and it harm none, do what you will. It's a bit more light and love. It's very much based on our intentions, sending these intentions out into the world. It often has a ritual magic bent that is inspired by these secret societies like the Ordo Templi Orientis, the Order of the Golden Dawn, the Masons, things like that. That's kind of Wiccan magic, and you can find innumerable spell books that are based on Wiccan magical systems. Now, with Wicca, you can kind of create your own spells, kind of, formulate whatever you want, work with deities, choose not to work with deities in your spell practices. Sometimes it involves casting a magic circle, sometimes it doesn't. But that's kind of the Wiccan system. Then you have this other system over here. And this is traditional witchcraft. Now, traditional witchcraft is more so based on folk magic and folklore. So traditional witchcraft is going to be a bit different than Wicca. Wicca tends to be a bit more new agey with kind of the character and the kind of vibe of the spells and that come from it, which, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine and that's fun and it's beautiful and warm and lovely. But if you're kind of a history nerd like I am, you might also be interested in kind of figuring out, well, what is traditional witchcraft? And what's neat is that almost every pagan path has its own form of traditional witchcraft that is based on kind of folkloric systems or based on the faith of the ancient culture. For example, we have Norse paganism, Satyr. That is the type of kind of mostly divinatory ancient Norse magic. I did a recent Pagan Happy Hour episode about Satyr and the Vova, or the Norse witch, that I recommend checking out if you are interested in learning. And that is an entirely separate magical system that is existing within the Norse pagan path. So, yes, you can practice witchcraft if you choose to be purely a Norse pagan by understanding and learning Satyr and by working with divinatory systems like the runes, for example. You have other ones. You have Mesoamerican paganism, right? You might have heard of brujas or Mexican witches, right? And they often have a witchcraft system that combines Aztec and Mayan practices and symbols and sigils with Christian saints and ideas and deities and things like that. So you're kind of having this kind of Christian combination with the earlier pagan faith among the Brujas. You also have in Italy, they have the Strega, or the Italian witch. So this is a topic I've done a previous Pagan Happy Hour episode on that you can look up later if you're interested in. So with Strega, kind of similar. It is a combination of the ancient Roman gods and Christianity. It is a folk magic. And then you have voodoo, right? Voodoo and hoodoo. What's the difference? Voodoo is the religion. Hoodoo is more the witchcraft practice within voodoo that combines both the deities from voodoo with Christianity. And it kind of has this whole magical system, right? In America, Appalachian folk magic. This might not be familiar with, but you should look into it if you're curious. People, mostly the Scots, were the ones who primarily settled in the Appalachian mountain chain, right? And I actually have one side of my family that's from the Appalachians. I was born in Chattanooga, so in among the Appalachians, they kind of brought with them British traditional witchcraft or Scottish traditional witchcraft with them, and that evolved and changed based on the climate, the culture of Appalachia. So Appalachian folk magic is a type of witchcraft that's existing within that system. I hope I'm not confusing you guys too much. And then you also have British traditional witchcraft, which is probably the most well-written form of traditional witchcraft, where there are plenty of books about it. Again, I recommend checking out a video I did on my book collection a couple weeks ago, where I share several of my favorites that discuss British traditional witchcraft. So there are all these different types and forms of witchcraft that are based more on traditional folklore and systems, and less on kind of new agey magic. So that's kind of the difference between those two. Let me see what you guys have to say here. We have a super chat from Sarah. Thank you very much. It says, "My main purpose in practice is justice. I guess I am a spiritual agnostic verging on atheist. I struggle with enriching my spirituality as part of me is woo-woo and part rooted in psych and science." Yeah, I think that's totally fine. That's definitely a form of kind of eclectic paganism or eclectic spirituality. So feel free to combine the woo-woo with the psychology, and see how that fits and see how intuitively you feel about that. Let's see, what else do we have? What else? Oh, sorry if my sound was cutting out. Can you still hear me okay? Checking my mic. Can you hear me okay? I think when Lily Bell walked past, it must have changed the sound for a moment as her hair kind of touched the mic. So I'm sorry about that. She just really wanted to be involved in this conversation. Um, so now a couple things about this traditional witchcraft system. Usually it doesn't have any type of moral creed like Wicca tends to do. It might be what you would consider like gray magic. It's not good, it's not bad. There's, some positive, there's some negative spells, it's kind of whatever you make it to be. Now, where did this come from? So traditions that have survived the Christianization of the culture, it can come from folklore. It could simply come from lessons your grandma taught you, right? Especially when you think of Appalachian folk magic, a lot of it's kind of just wisdom from the old crones, right? The crone magic. What was the elder women in your community saying? What wisdom did they offer? What herbs were they using? And I mean crone in the best term possible because I hope to be a badass crone someday. Um, so it could just be simply lessons from your grandma. That could be traditional witchcraft. Sometimes it's a bit more literary, especially in British traditional witchcraft, where people are literally combing through witch trial records and using the confessions of the witches. Some of them were most likely not witches, maybe most of them weren't. But the point is, they're using that information and creating spells, magical practices, rituals based on that, in combination with the folklore of the region. So this type of traditional witchcraft tends to be very much bioregional, using the herbs and the kind of holidays and wheel of the year that exists kind of in that location. So do keep that in mind. It's a lot of herbal healing, herbal cursing, things like that. Could be a little bit of chaos magic, sigil magic thrown in there. And it can be very fascinating to study and research this. So if you're wanting to incorporate witchcraft into your paganism, which you definitely do not have to do, keep in mind that pretty much every pagan culture has its own form of witchcraft or shamanism, or shamanic magic that you can study and see how you can incorporate it into your own spiritual path. Um, so let me see what else you guys have to say there. Now, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to traditional witchcraft, a lot of it does tend to be based on your own personal heritage or culture. For example, like I was saying, a lot of traditional witchcraft comes from what your grandma taught you, that kind of thing. It's based on bioregionalism, where you live, where you grew up. It doesn't have to be. I'm not saying you can't practice strega if you're not Italian, but I am saying the vast majority of people who practice traditional witchcraft are practicing traditional witchcraft that aligns with either where they grew up or their heritage. So when I practice traditional witchcraft, I'm mostly looking towards Appalachian folk magic as well as uh, British traditional magic. Sorry, she's just really wanting to be involved. Um, so let me see. But totally lost my train of thought with the cat there. So we kind of discussed the whole witchcraft bent. I hope that helps. Now, I do have a whole video that I did several years ago on different types of witches. So you might have heard terminology like green witch or kitchen witch or chaos witch, there's so many of them. That's mostly through the Wiccan system, because within a Wiccan system, you're also kind of specializing in certain areas of witchcraft, which again, you don't have to do. But that's where those terms come from. So if you're wondering how that works, those are different types of specializations of magical practice within Wicca versus traditional witchcraft, which is just specializing in a particular culture or heritage and studying the magical system that survives through folklore and folk magic. I hope that helps. Please tell me if you're confused, because I want to know if I'm being clear here or if you are still confused. A good comment here or question from the Neon Cicada that mentions ceremonial magic. Ceremonial magic is another type of magical system that is often Wiccan in nature. You can think of Raymond Buckland. You can think of Scott Cunningham or Gerald Gardner. These are good names to look up if you're interested in ceremonial magic. Now, ceremonial magic is, again, really inspired by the secret societies. So, the Order of the Golden Dawn being the main one that formulates the structure of these systems. So yeah, that's a good point. I didn't bring up ceremonial magic. Maybe I'll have to do a whole separate, pagan happy hour down the road about that. Let's see. Oh gosh. My cat is just creating chaos. So it's good that we only have 5 minutes to go. So now in the chat, if you did enjoy this episode, if you did learn a bit and you are interested in supporting the show, now would be a great time to do a super chat to donate any amount so I can keep making you these videos every week. And let me know what questions you guys have in the comments for our last few minutes. I'd love to answer any questions you guys have about different pagan paths. I know this is kind of a confusing topic because there are so many branches to take it. And I hope I did it justice today. But let's see what you guys have to say in the comments. Okay. Let's see. Uh, Wednesday says, I love the content. I learned so much. Thank you so much, Wednesday. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Let's see. Ralph is asking about Cernunnos. That is Celtic paganism for the most part. So I would look into that, though there's also some kind of Germanic paganism aspect to it as well. Good question. Let's see, what else do we have? Okay, any other questions, guys? Let's see. I see someone mentioning Ocean Keltoy. That's another good channel to check out if you are into learning more about Norse paganism specifically. Yeah. I think he's on my Discord community too, so you can chat with him there if you want. A super chat from Kaylee that says, what do you think about pseudoscience and witchcraft? Witchcraft is really interesting. I recommend this book called Real Magic by Dean Radin. And that book kind of takes a scientific approach to magic and tests certain kind of experiments or magical experiments on how can we actually use intention and focused thought to generate change. And he studies it scientifically, kind of proving that actually, yeah, there is some scientific basis on how our thoughts can affect real change. So recommend checking that out. Let me see. Wednesday is asking, would you ever do a pagan happy hour on the crone? How to celebrate becoming one? Oh my gosh, that is such a great idea for a future pagan happy hour. And something I think I've ranted about often on my channel is how in modern Western culture, there is nowhere for women to go after we age out of motherhood, that our value in society is mostly based on youth, and how the pagan societies, I think, had a better approach to the sacred feminine, where women kind of went through different stages, and the crone being a very powerful and rewarding stage of a woman's life. So I hope to be a good crone someday, and I hope we can rethink our perspective on older women in the society. Let's see. Okay. Awesome. Oh, Happy Tree says, I'm skipping motherhood and going straight for crone. Me too. I don't think I'm going to be a mom. I think I'm going to go straight to crone. But let's see. Oh my God, you guys are such a great group today. Thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts and ideas. I think this has been a really interesting and engaging discussion. If you did enjoy this episode, if you do enjoy my channel, definitely check out my Patreon link down below. And of course, like and subscribe if you have not yet. That really does help this channel grow and helps allow me to continue making these videos for you guys every week. And now that we are out of time, I want to give you a cheers. I want to say thank you guys so much for joining me all today, and I'll see you next week. Bye.